Hello, James Hall here. Going to go ahead and give my week 5 presentation of the case studies that we were given. I chose the Police Battalion 101, the German Police Battalion 101, to do a little bit of research on and give my presentation about. During my research of the case, it was very surprising to find out that 1/3 of the deaths of the Jewish victims did not come from concentration camps. In fact, they were killed by the German police forces and their local, helpers. They were killed near their homes and in the surrounding fields and forests. According to the German Police Battalion 101, written by Dr. Lichtenstein of the University of Texas at Austin, she said that these policing kill squad forces were responsible for 2 million deaths of the Jewish population during World War II. In the book Ordinary Men, Reserve Police Battalion 101 and the Final Solution for Poland, historian Christopher Browning shed some light on the fact that the participants that took place in these killings were actually, given the opportunity to refuse to kill, and instead they would be allowed to perform, other duties instead of the killings. Unfortunately, the majority of the ordinary middle-aged young men, they followed through with the killings, even though they weren't necessarily enthusiastic about it, but they would rather carry out the murder than to look, weak or to seem cowardly in the eyes of their comrades. So to me, whenever I look at this situation, there is a slew of things that we could look at. I feel like the root issue of this circumstance comes from a top-down toxic environment that stemmed from Hitler down to his generals, which eventually led all the way down to the unit leaders that were encouraging this type of behavior. To me, it would be very difficult to stand up and to have the character during this, tyrannical government takeover. And while, this root issue would take hours to unpack, to me, it kind of falls down in this specific scenario to 3, main bullets of what we're kind of dealing with here. One being, why did the average Joe on the street elect to take up arms against his neighbors and carry out a mass murder under the guidance of the German 101 Police Battalion's leadership? Number 2 would be, why was there support amongst the civilians for murdering their Jewish neighbors? And then 3, why did the individuals not stand up to this tyrannical type leadership and speak out, against it? I feel that by understanding these 3 key ethical failures, we could see how the non-Jewish men would be able to murder their neighbors just in cold blood. First, we would want to look at, why the average citizen, felt that it was okay to go ahead and murder his neighbor. From an ethical standpoint in this scenario, I see it as an I and thou type scenario. It has the basis in trust and manipulation and interpersonal relationships. As our book points out, in chapter 7, and the trust and manipulations and interpersonal relationships, they claim that the trust is established over time. It's not given in 2 or 3 meetings with one another. And therefore, whenever the German police would show up to these towns, they would gather all the men, they would put them in formation, and they would, basically hand out the tasks. They said that they could perform these other duties, and no one with their group could easily, and no one, trusted that leader. They hadn't met him before. There was no trust that had been given. Therefore, instead, most of them elected to stay with their group. And, it could be easily understood that if they followed as a group, they would be treated fair, and they personally would be safe. And unfortunately, that led to the deaths of these 2 million individuals. While I can understand, the second point here would be, while I can understand that the individuals elected safety in numbers of those that they trusted, why would there be the need to kill, these 2 million people in the first place? And realistically, 6 million people, 6 million Jewish people overall. One aspect that chapter 5 points out in our book is that it comes down to a lack of unconditional positive regard for individuals, let alone the entire Jewish community. And this unconditional positive regard, you give the person, or in this case, the entire race, a full, caring, undivided attention without judging them. And this is going to allow you to accept different values and beliefs, their feelings, or even their goals. This allows the communication to be empowering to both the listener and the speaker, and it helps us reach that ethical human peak of performance and potential. But instead, they have that toxic, top-down leadership environment that created untrustworthy and manipulative environment and forced people to unfortunately believe in themselves and just trust the group mindset of safety in numbers, leading again to that death of 2 million people. Finally, for my third point, I would talk about, why did only a few people, if any, speak out against a tyrannical leadership? Coming back to chapter 7 in our book, we look about how ethics of self-disclosure, and it points out that there is a risk with self-disclosure. While the article claims that, a few other people had taken the other tasks, it doesn't necessarily lay out, how those people were treated afterwards, or what the response was of the tyrannical leadership of the time. I know this, kind of comes back to that trust type issue, but, the act of self-disclosure really comes down to what we ought to do versus, something that we chose to do. I feel like if people actually looked at necessarily what we ought to have done, maybe this scenario would have turned out to be a little bit different. My recommendation, based on the analysis of the alternative courses of action, it would be very difficult to make that decision of what I ought to do versus what I chose to do. I hope that I would be strong enough to make that decision, to do what's right in my own eyes, that I am not worried about, what a tyrannical government says, that I can sleep at night knowing that the decisions I've made is what I am going to, the consequences that I'm going to live with, whether they're good or they're bad. I think I would be able to live with those type of decisions. But on the other hand, I would want to know the choices that I made, would not end in a negative result for, maybe my family or those that I love that are around me. How could I seal their fate, knowing that if I stood up to these tyrannical leaders, that I was going to kill, my wife and my children? It just puts us in a very difficult spot. I feel like no matter what, unfortunately, my voice, one man's voice, wouldn't have made a major impact in a world war. And the genocide of 6 million people, how horrific that was. But if I could go and maybe sacrifice myself or stand up for my own beliefs, however that would pan out, I feel like it would be best that I can make the right decision, knowing that I'm going to protect the ones that I love. I'm going to protect the people that need it, and I'm going to give my life or suffer the consequences of standing up for what I believe in, even whenever it's not necessarily the popular decision. Doing what I ought to do, not necessarily what's easily chosen to do. And if it would help save more people, then that would be worth it. Thank you for your time, and have a great evening.